The echoes of courage. Sarah Adams never imagined that life would push her into the kind of bravery that could alter the course of her world. At 39, she was just trying to survive. A cleaner by profession, she had spent 15 long years working for Crestwell Enterprises, a sprawling corporate giant where the decisions made in the boardrooms rarely reflected the realities lived by those on the ground. For Sarah, the company was not just her job. It was the lifeline that supported her and her son Ryan. A single mother with a 10-year-old boy suffering from severe asthma, her life was a delicate balancing act. One slight misstep, and everything could crumble. Every day, Sarah woke up at 5:30 a.m., her weary body moving on autopilot through the motions. Her small, cramped apartment was a stark contrast to the gleaming high-rise towers of Crestwell. The quiet hum of the city was only broken by the sounds of Ryan's labored breathing, a constant reminder of the medical bills that never stopped coming. His condition had worsened over the past few months, and each breath he took seemed to resonate with Sarah's inner struggle to keep everything afloat. "Mom, why do you have to leave so early?" Ryan asked, his voice soft but tinged with worry. His small body looked even frailer under the superhero bedspread he loved so much. Sarah kneeled beside him, brushing a lock of curly hair from his forehead. "Because I have to, sweetie. But don't worry, Mrs. Millie will be here soon, and I'll be back before you know it." Mrs. Millie was their elderly neighbor who had become something of a second grandmother to Ryan, always stepping in to help when Sarah had to work long hours. "Will I ever get to play soccer again, Mom?" Ryan's hopeful eyes searched hers, the question a dagger to her heart. He had always been an active child before the asthma had taken a stronger hold on him. Sarah forced a smile, even though her chest tightened with uncertainty. "Of course you will, Ryan. Just wait a little longer, okay? You're a superhero, and superheroes always get back on their feet." After one last hug, Sarah left the apartment, her heart heavier with every step. The walk to the bus stop was her time to think, but the thoughts swirling in her head were always the same. Medical bills, rent, Ryan's schoolwork, and her stagnant job. Despite her years of loyalty to Crestwell, she remained just the woman who pushed a cart, cleaned floors, and made sure the boardroom sparkled for executives who wouldn't remember her name. Yet, today was different. Today was the big day. Crestwell's quarterly shareholders meeting. Rumor had it that Mr. William Cartwright, the formidable CEO, would be presenting groundbreaking numbers that promised an increase in employee satisfaction, record profits, and a rosy future for everyone. Everyone except Sarah and the other ground floor workers who had been invisible cogs in the machine. This was nothing new. Crestwell's leaders had mastered the art of putting a glossy sheen on their reality, one that didn't reflect the hardships Sarah knew intimately. As she entered the corporate building, Sarah felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. She went through her routine, cleaning the offices, emptying the trash, making sure every surface gleamed. Hours later, it was time. With a cart of coffee and refreshments in tow, Sarah pushed through the double doors of the executive conference room, where the meeting was already in full swing. The room buzzed with quiet excitement. The executives, dressed in tailored suits, sat around the massive mahogany table, their attention fixated on Mr. Cartwright, who stood at the head of the room. Sarah began moving from one end of the table to the other, serving coffee and tea as the presentation continued. And as you can see, Mr. Cartwright's deep, authoritative voice boomed through the room. "Our latest employee satisfaction survey shows a remarkable 87% positive response. This is the highest we've seen in years, and it's a testament to how well we're treating our people." Sarah paused mid-pour, her hands trembling slightly. 87%. How could that be? She knew dozens of employees who were unhappy, some even on the verge of quitting. Maintenance staff, lower-level employees, cleaners like herself, they were often stretched too thin, barely paid enough to cover living expenses, let alone medical emergencies. But here was the CEO, confidently stating that all was well in Crestwell's world. Sarah's mind raced. The numbers were wrong. She knew they were wrong, but speaking out, challenging the CEO of all people, was not something she could do. She was just the cleaner, just the woman with a cart. No one would care what she had to say. But then something deep inside her rebelled against that thought. Her hands tightened on the coffee pot as she finished pouring for the last executive. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, her pulse quickening. What would Ryan think if he knew she let something like this pass? He looked up to her as his protector, his hero. How could she stand by and watch a lie be fed to the very people who control the company's future? Sarah took a deep breath. Her entire body was shaking now, not from fear, but from the growing resolve. If no one else would speak up, she would. Slowly, she made her way toward the head of the table, where Mr. Cartwright was wrapping up his presentation. "Excuse me, Mr. Cartwright," Sarah said, her voice quiet but steady. The room went silent. Every head turned toward her, disbelief etched on their faces. I think there's a mistake in the numbers." Cartwright's brows furrowed. He glanced at her, then at the executives around the table, clearly unsure of what to make of the interruption. "A mistake," he repeated, his tone patronizing. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. I've been here for 15 years, and I know a lot of the staff. They're not happy. Many of them are struggling, and some are even thinking of leaving. I don't think that 87% satisfaction rate is accurate." The silence that followed was palpable. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, but she stood her ground. Her knees trembled, but her voice remained strong. She had spoken the truth, and now it was out in the open. Mr. Cartwright's face darkened. "You're mistaken, Ms. Adams," he said coldly. "We trust the data that was presented. It's been vetted by HR." Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she refused to back down. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not mistaken. The employees deserve to be heard." Before she could say another word, Cartwright raised his hand, cutting her off. "That's enough. Thank you for your input, but this is a shareholders' meeting. Please leave the room." The command was firm, and Sarah knew she had overstepped. But as she turned to leave, she saw something in the eyes of the executives. Respect. They hadn't expected it, but they had heard her. As she closed the door behind her, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had done it. She had spoken up. But now, the real question loomed. What would the consequences be? A ripple of consequences. The rest of the day passed in a haze. As Sarah left the boardroom, her mind whirled with a mix of fear and pride. She had spoken up in front of Crestwell's most powerful people, something she had never dreamed of doing. But now, as the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what she'd done began to sink in. The corporate world wasn't kind to people who crossed lines, especially when those people were just cleaners. Sarah pushed her cleaning cart through the halls, the clattering of the wheels on the floor echoing louder than usual in the sterile, cold corridors of the office building. She passed a few colleagues who had heard rumors of what happened, their eyes filled with a mix of surprise and concern. No one dared ask her what had transpired, but Sarah could feel their curiosity. As she made her way back to the maintenance room, she replayed the scene over and over in her mind. The way Mr. Cartwright had shut her down, his stern expression a clear warning that she had crossed a boundary. Had she gone too far? She tried to steady herself with the thought that speaking the truth shouldn't be punishable, but reality had taught her that sometimes it was. When Sarah finally clocked out and left the building, the evening sky had already darkened. The streets of the city buzzed with life as people hurried home, but for Sarah, the world felt unnervingly quiet. The walk to her apartment felt heavier than usual, and the familiar sight of her worn-out building didn't bring the usual sense of comfort. She entered, her mind consumed with thoughts of what might come next. Opening the door to her small apartment, Sarah was greeted by the sound of Ryan's coughing. It was a sound she had grown accustomed to, but one that always filled her with a sharp pang of fear. Mrs. Millie, her elderly neighbor, was sitting beside him on the worn-out couch, holding a glass of water in her wrinkled hands. "Sarah, dear, how was your day?" Mrs. Millie asked gently, though Sarah could see the question was just a polite gesture. Millie knew the weight that hung over Sarah's life. It was complicated, Sarah answered, setting her bag down and walking over to Ryan. She kissed his forehead, her heart sinking as she felt the heat radiating from his small body. He had a fever. How's my little superhero? Ryan smiled weakly, though it was clear he wasn't feeling well. I'm okay, Mom. Did you save the world today? He asked, his voice raspy from the persistent coughing. Sarah smiled, though the weight of her own world seemed to be closing in on her. Not quite. But I tried, she said softly, running her fingers through his curls. She exchanged a worried glance with Mrs. Millie, who nodded subtly in understanding. After helping Ryan settle into bed, Sarah returned to the kitchen, where Mrs. Millie sat waiting with her cup of tea. The apartment was small but filled with warmth, thanks to the elderly woman who had become like family to Sarah and Ryan. Millie had lived across the hall for as long as Sarah could remember, and she had stepped in when Sarah needed help the most, especially after Ryan's asthma had worsened. You seem troubled, dear. Is something on your mind? Mrs. Millie asked, her voice soothing but filled with the wisdom of someone who had lived through many storms. Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of the day press down on her shoulders. She hadn't told anyone what had happened at work, but sitting here now, with Millie's kind eyes watching her, she felt the words bubbling up. I spoke up today, Millie. At work, during the big shareholders' meeting, Sarah began, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. I pointed out that the numbers they presented about employee satisfaction were wrong. I said people were struggling, that the truth wasn't being told. Millie's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She waited patiently for Sarah to continue. I don't know why I did it. It just felt wrong. They were all sitting there, talking about how great everything was, and I knew it wasn't true. People are unhappy. Some can barely make ends meet. But Mr. Cartwright, he didn't like being corrected. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for her cup of tea. Oh, Sarah, Millie said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. You've always had a good heart. Speaking up like that takes courage. I know. But I'm scared, Millie. What if I lose my job? What if this ruins everything? Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her fears finally breaking through. Ryan depends on me. I can't afford to make mistakes like this. I need this job. The bills, the medical expenses, it's all too much. Millie squeezed Sarah's hand gently, her gaze filled with compassion. You did the right thing, Sarah. The truth is important. But I understand your worry. Crestwell is a powerful company, and they don't always appreciate honesty. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She stayed up late that night, long after Mrs. Millie had gone home and Ryan had fallen asleep. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills that seemed to grow higher every month. The weight of responsibility felt unbearable, but there was no way out. She had to keep going, for Ryan's sake. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing loudly on the nightstand. Groggily, she reached for it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Human Resources. Her stomach twisted with dread as she answered the call, her voice shaky. Hello. Sarah, this is Greg from HR. We need you to come in for a meeting this afternoon. The voice on the other end said, calm but businesslike. Sarah felt her blood run cold. A meeting with HR was never a good sign. Is everything okay? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. There have been some concerns raised about your conduct during yesterday's shareholders' meeting, Greg continued, his tone giving nothing away. We'll discuss it in detail during the meeting. Please be here by 2:00 p.m. The call ended before Sarah could ask anything else. She sat there for a moment, the phone still in her hand, her mind racing. This was it. She had overstepped, and now the consequences were coming. She spent the rest of the morning in a daze, trying to keep herself busy, but the fear gnawed at her relentlessly. What would she do if she lost her job? How would she provide for Ryan? At exactly 1:45 p.m., Sarah walked into the sleek office building, her heart pounding in her chest. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, but there was a tension in the air that Sarah couldn't shake. She was led to a small, cold conference room, where Greg from HR and a few other senior managers sat waiting. "Please have a seat, Sarah," Greg said, gesturing to the chair in the middle of the room. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the judgment in the air, the invisible wall that separated her from these people who held her future in their hands. "Sarah, we're here to discuss the incident at yesterday's meeting," Greg began, his tone professional but detached. "It's been brought to our attention that you interrupted a formal presentation by the CEO, which is a serious breach of protocol. Do you understand why that's a problem?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. But I only spoke up because I believe the information being presented was inaccurate. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I know the employees, and I felt like their voices weren't being heard." Greg exchanged a glance with one of the other managers before continuing. "We appreciate your concern, Sarah, but there's a time and place for raising issues. And that wasn't it. We've reviewed your case, and while we understand that you were trying to help, we can't ignore the disruption this caused." Sarah's heart sank. She knew what was coming next. "We've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately," Greg said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You'll receive a severance package, but we ask that you collect your belongings and leave the premises today." Sarah felt the room spin around her. Termination. The word echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. All the years of loyalty, the hard work, the sacrifices, none of it mattered. She had spoken up for what was right, and now she was paying the price. She stood up, her legs shaky as she nodded silently. She didn't have the strength to argue. The weight of everything crashed down on her all at once. Without a word, she left the room, the sound of the door closing behind her signaling the end of one chapter in her life. As Sarah gathered her things from the janitor's closet, the familiar smells of cleaning supplies and disinfectant suddenly felt foreign, as though she no longer belonged. Her mind was numb, and her body moved on autopilot. Her coworkers passed by, their eyes filled with pity and uncertainty. No one said a word. By the time Sarah reached the front doors of the building, she felt like a ghost. The world outside seemed too bright, too loud. She clutched her bag to her chest, trying to keep herself together as she walked down the street. When she got home, Ryan was still at school, and the apartment was eerily quiet. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, her eyes staring blankly at the stack of bills she could no longer pay. She had stood up for the truth, but in doing so, she had lost everything. The storm before the dawn. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled termination letter in front of her. The black ink on the page felt like a condemnation of her life, her choices, her courage. Her fingers traced the outline of the words as if trying to erase the reality they spelled out. "Your employment with Crestwell Enterprises is terminated effective immediately." The apartment was silent, save for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, a gift from Mrs. Millie. It felt like a countdown, an ominous reminder that time was still moving forward, even though Sarah's life seemed to have come to a screeching halt. Her mind raced, thinking of Ryan. His medications were running low, and she hadn't paid the rent yet. A single month's severance pay wasn't going to cover everything, not the rent, the bills, and certainly not the costly inhalers that kept Ryan's breathing steady. She felt suffocated, as if the walls were closing in on her. The door creaked open, and Ryan burst into the apartment, his laughter filling the small space like sunshine. For a moment, Sarah smiled, the weight of her fears lifting ever so slightly. Ryan's joy was her lifeline. But then he began coughing, the harsh sound cutting through the air like a knife. She rushed to his side, guiding him to the couch and grabbing his inhaler. "Breathe, sweetheart," slow and steady. "I'm here," she murmured, her heart clenching as he gasped for breath. It took a few moments, but the medication worked, and his coughing eased. "Thanks, Mom," Ryan whispered, exhausted. His small body leaned against her as he caught his breath. Sarah looked at him, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let him see how scared she was. "You're my superhero, remember? Superheroes always get back up." Ryan grinned weakly and nodded. "Yeah, like Batman." "Exactly," Sarah replied, though her heart was heavy. How was she supposed to protect him when everything was falling apart? As Ryan's breathing steadied, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table, jolting her back to the present. The number was unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Hello," she said hesitantly. "Is this Sarah Adams?" The voice on the other end asked. It was a woman, her tone calm but authoritative. "Yes, this is she." "Who's calling?" "This is Amelia Jenkins from Crestwell Enterprises. I'm one of the company's shareholders." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Amelia Jenkins. She remembered her from the boardroom, one of the few people who had looked at her with something other than disdain when she had spoken up. "I wanted to reach out personally," Amelia continued. "I heard about your dismissal. I'm sorry for what happened, Sarah. You deserved better than that." Sarah was stunned. Amelia Jenkins, a wealthy shareholder, was calling her to express sympathy. "Why?" "Thank you, ma'am." She stammered, unsure of what to say. "Please, call me Amelia," the woman interrupted, her tone softening. "I wanted to speak to you because I think you did something incredibly brave. Most people wouldn't have the courage to stand up in that meeting, especially not with the risks involved." Sarah's throat tightened. I just told the truth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but she didn't have much hope left to hold on to. Amelia paused, as if weighing her words carefully. "Sarah, I believe you have something this company desperately needs: integrity. I know you've been let go, but I'm calling to offer you a meeting. Not with HR. With me." Sarah's mind raced. A meeting? What could Amelia possibly want with her? She had just been fired, cast out without a second thought. What good could come from this? I'm not sure what I could offer," Sarah replied hesitantly. "I'm just a cleaner." Amelia's voice became firm. "You're not just anything, Sarah. You have a perspective no one else in that room had, and that makes you valuable. I want to hear what you have to say. Can you meet me tomorrow?" Sarah's mind swirled with confusion and disbelief. This felt too surreal. She had been fired less than 24 hours ago, and now one of the most powerful shareholders wanted to meet with her. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but deep down, she knew she had no other options. Ryan's future depended on her finding a way forward. "Okay," Sarah agreed, her voice steadying. "I'll be there." They finalized the details, and as Sarah hung up the phone, a glimmer of hope flickered inside her. But it was a fragile hope, balanced on the edge of the unknown. The next day, Sarah dressed in her best clothes. Nothing fancy, just the only outfit she had that didn't look worn from years of use. As she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection stared back at her, anxious but determined. This meeting could change everything, or it could confirm her worst fears. As she entered the towering office building where she had worked for over a decade, she felt a strange sense of detachment. The shiny floors, the marble columns, the pristine glass walls, it was all so familiar, yet today it felt foreign. She was no longer part of this world, a ghost walking through the halls. The receptionist, who had always greeted her with polite indifference, now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and confusion as Sarah stated she had a meeting with Amelia Jenkins. The woman raised her eyebrows but made the call, then motioned for Sarah to take a seat in the sleek waiting area. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, Amelia appeared, her presence commanding yet warm. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with silver streaks running through her dark hair and an air of quiet authority. "Sarah, thank you for coming," Amelia said, offering a firm handshake. "Let's go somewhere more private." Sarah followed her into a large corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. It was a breathtaking view, but Sarah was too focused on the gravity of the situation to admire it. Amelia gestured for her to sit, and they both settled into chairs near the large desk. For a moment, neither spoke, and Sarah's heart raced, unsure of what was coming next. "I've been with Crestwell for over 20 years, Amelia began, her tone calm but serious. "And in that time, I've seen a lot of things I didn't agree with. The way you were treated after speaking up, that was one of them." Sarah swallowed, still unsure of where this conversation was headed. "You see, Sarah," Amelia continued, leaning forward slightly, "I believe that people like you are the backbone of this company. Not the executives sitting in their ivory towers, but the ones on the ground, making everything run smoothly. Without you and others like you, Crestwell would crumble." Sarah nodded, still wary but grateful for the acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I don't know what you want from me, Amelia. I've already lost my job." Amelia's expression softened. "I want you to come back to Crestwell, Sarah, but not as a cleaner. I want you to work with me in a position where your voice can make a difference." Sarah blinked, stunned. "What do you mean? Work with you?" Amelia smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You see, I've been looking for someone like you. Someone who understands the realities of this company, not just from the top but from the ground up. I want you to join my team, to help me change things from the inside." Sarah felt as if the room had tilted on its axis. This wasn't just a second chance. This was an opportunity she could never have dreamed of. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because, Sarah, you have something most people in this company don't: courage. You're not afraid to speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient. That's the kind of person I need." Sarah's mind raced. The offer was unbelievable. After years of feeling invisible, of being just another cog in the machine, someone was finally seeing her for who she was. Someone was offering her a chance to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for all the employees who felt voiceless, just like she had. But the fear still lingered. Could she really do this? Could she walk back into the company that had cast her out and fight to change it from within? "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this," Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've only ever been a cleaner." Amelia reached across the table, placing a hand on Sarah's. "You're more than ready, Sarah. You just don't know it yet. Let me help you. Let us do this together." Sarah looked into Amelia's eyes, seeing the sincerity and determination there. She thought of Ryan, of the life she wanted to build for him, and of the future she had almost given up on. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll help you." Amelia smiled, this time a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Welcome aboard, Sarah. We're going to change things." As Sarah left the office that day, a new sense of purpose settled over her. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was a woman with a voice that could shape the future of the company, and more importantly, the future of her own life. The battle within. The city lights twinkled in the distance as Sarah stood by her apartment window, her thoughts swirling in an exhausting spiral. The day had been nothing short of surreal. Amelia's offer replayed in her mind, a lifeline she had never expected. A chance to not only regain her footing but to do something meaningful. It was an opportunity that filled her with hope, but it also terrified her. How could she, a woman who had spent the last 15 years scrubbing floors, help reshape the towering empire of Crestwell Enterprises? Ryan stirred in his sleep, the soft sound of his breathing a comforting reminder of why she had to be brave. She couldn't afford to be afraid, not when everything she did was for him. His health, his future, everything hinged on her ability to succeed in this new chapter. She wouldn't let him down. As she sat down at the kitchen table, her hands moved automatically, picking up the pile of bills that had accumulated over the past month. Overdue rent, medical bills, the electric bill that threatened disconnection. Each envelope was like a ticking time bomb. waiting to detonate if she couldn't find a way to stop it. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: optimism. Amelia's offer, if it led to steady work, would give her the financial stability she desperately needed. More than that, it was a chance to build the life she and Ryan deserved, not just survive paycheck to paycheck. The next morning, Sarah left her apartment early, the cold air biting at her skin as she made her way back to the office building she thought she'd never see again. Her heart raced with anticipation, fear, and something that felt like determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for every worker at Crestwell who had felt invisible, undervalued, and voiceless. As she entered the lobby of Crestwell Enterprises, a rush of emotions hit her. The familiar sights of sleek marble floors, high ceilings, and polished glass walls all felt different now. This time, she wasn't just a cleaner pushing a cart, blending into the background. She was here for a new purpose, and her role in this place was about to change dramatically. The receptionist, who had always greeted her with polite indifference, now gave her a more puzzled look. Sarah was no longer the cleaner she once was, and that shift in perception, though subtle, was palpable. "Good morning, Sarah." Amelia greeted her warmly as Sarah entered her office, the large windows casting a bright glow over the room. Amelia's office, with its plush leather chairs and expansive view of the city, was a stark contrast to the janitor's closet where Sarah had once kept her cleaning supplies. But now, this was where she belonged, at least for today. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice steady, but her nerves still on edge. Amelia gestured for Sarah to sit across from her, and as she did, Sarah felt the enormity of the moment sink in. She had no experience in the corporate world, no formal education in business, but Amelia had seen something in her, something that had pushed the powerful shareholder to take this chance on her. "I know this is a lot to take in, Sarah," Amelia began, her tone gentle but firm. "But I want you to understand that this isn't just about giving you a job. This is about helping you make the changes you spoke of. You have a unique perspective, one that people like me, who've been in boardrooms for decades, sometimes lose sight of. We need that perspective to make real change." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "But I don't know anything about how to run a company, Amelia. I'm just—" "Stop right there," Amelia interrupted, raising a hand. "You're not just anything. You've been here longer than most of the people in management positions. You understand how this company works, not from the top down, but from the ground up. And that's what we need. I'm not asking you to run the company. I'm asking you to help us see what we've been blind to." Sarah took a deep breath, letting Amelia's words sink in. There was truth in them. She had spent years watching how things worked, or didn't work. At Crestwell, she knew which employees were struggling, which departments were overworked and underappreciated, and she knew how hard it was for the lower-tier staff to survive on the wages they were given. She had lived that struggle every day. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked finally, her voice stronger than she expected. Amelia leaned forward, her eyes sharp with focus. "I want you to attend the next few board meetings, not as a participant, yet, but as an observer. I want you to listen, take notes, and tell me what you think. What's working, what's not. Your perspective will help me when it's time to propose changes." Sarah's stomach twisted at the thought of sitting in a room full of powerful executives, watching them make decisions that affected thousands of lives. But she nodded. "I can do that." "And," Amelia continued, "I also want you to talk to the employees, not just the ones at the top. Everyone. The janitors, the maintenance staff, the customer service reps. I want to hear their stories, their struggles. I need you to be their voice." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was the kind of work she had dreamed of, advocating for the people who had been overlooked, just as she had been. But it was also terrifying. Could she really stand up to the powerful forces within Crestwell and make a difference? "I'll do it," Sarah said, her voice filled with newfound determination. "I'll talk to them. Amelia smiled. Good. I know this won't be easy, Sarah, but I believe in you. We're going to change things. Sarah's first day in her new role began quietly. She walked through the halls of Crestwell, taking in the familiar faces of employees she had once worked alongside. Many of them looked at her with confusion or surprise, unsure of why she wasn't wearing her cleaning uniform. She stopped to speak with some of them. Janitors, security guards, office assistants, people who had shared the same struggles she knew all too well. She listened to their stories. The janitor who worked 2 jobs to support his family, the young receptionist who was drowning in student loan debt, the maintenance worker whose hours had been cut but who still showed up every day because he had no other choice. Their stories mirrored her own: hardship, exhaustion, and a feeling of being invisible in a company that only cared about profits. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her first board meeting. The conference room was filled with Crestwell's most powerful executives, men and women dressed in expensive suits, their voices confident as they discussed quarterly profits, future investments, and strategies for expanding the company's market share. Sarah sat quietly in the back, her notepad open, trying to absorb as much as she could. But as the meeting progressed, she realized something disturbing. No one was talking about the employees. No one mentioned the janitors who worked late into the night, or the customer service reps who dealt with angry clients all day long. It was all about the numbers: how to cut costs, how to increase revenue. The people who made the company run weren't part of the conversation. When the meeting ended, Sarah felt a mix of anger and frustration. How could they not see it? How could they sit in that room and ignore the very people who were the foundation of the company? As the executives filed out of the room, Amelia approached Sarah, her expression unreadable. "What did you think?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words, but she knew she couldn't hold back. "They didn't talk about the employees," she said finally. "They didn't mention the people who keep this place running. It's all about money, profits, but without the employees, there is no company." Amelia nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You're right, and that's exactly why I need you here. You see what they don't." Sarah looked down at her notepad, where she had scribbled notes throughout the meeting. "I don't know if I can make them see it, though," she admitted. "They're so focused on the bottom line." Amelia placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Change takes time, Sarah, but we're planting the seeds, and you're a part of that." Sarah nodded, though the weight of the task ahead still pressed heavily on her. This wasn't going to be easy. She was walking into a battle against a deeply entrenched system, one that valued profits over people. But she knew she had to try, not just for herself, but for the employees who had been overlooked for far too long. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to meet with employees across Crestwell, gathering their stories and learning more about the struggles they faced. She spent hours talking to janitors, clerks, receptionists, and lower-level staff, each of them sharing the same common theme. They felt invisible, undervalued, and overworked. Many of them feared speaking up, worried that they would lose their jobs if they did. Sarah felt a growing sense of responsibility. She had been given a platform, a chance to amplify the voices of those who couldn't speak for themselves. But with that platform came pressure. Could she really make a difference in such a massive, profit-driven corporation? One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Sarah returned home to find Ryan sitting at the kitchen table, a drawing in front of him. His asthma had been stable, and for the first time in a long time, he seemed more like his old self, full of energy and curiosity. "Mom, look," Ryan said excitedly, holding up the drawing. It was a picture of a superhero, standing tall in front of a skyscraper. The superhero wore a cape and had a determined look on her face. "Is that me?" Sarah asked, surprised. Ryan grinned. "Yeah, you're a superhero now, right? You're going to save all the people at your work." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, smiling at her son. "I don't know about that, buddy. but I'm going to try." Ryan nodded seriously. "That's what superheroes do. They try." The battle lines drawn. The weeks turned into months, and Sarah's world became a whirlwind of meetings, late-night conversations with Crestwell's lower-level employees, and long hours trying to piece together a plan that could spark real change. Every step forward felt like she was trudging through thick mud, slow, painful, and met with resistance from those who held the power. But she kept going, fueled by the stories of the janitors, the secretaries, and the maintenance workers who had shared their lives with her, trusting her to be their voice. Amelia had been a guiding force throughout it all, offering advice, encouragement, and insight into the corporate machine that Sarah was beginning to understand better. But with each passing day, Sarah felt the weight of the challenge more acutely. Crestwell Enterprises wasn't just any company, it was an empire. And empires did not change easily. Every policy, every decision, seemed designed to maximize profits at the expense of the workers who kept the wheels turning. And Sarah was fighting to shift that balance. It wasn't long before Sarah's efforts began to draw attention. And not all of it was welcome. One morning, Sarah sat in the corner of a conference room, her notebook in hand, listening to yet another board meeting where the focus was, as always, on numbers. The executives spoke in crisp, business-like tones, discussing the quarterly earnings, the expansion into new markets, and how to cut operational costs. Sarah couldn't help but notice that every time cutting costs came up, it always seemed to involve trimming benefits for employees or scaling back on workforce protections. The tension in the room was palpable, especially when Amelia, now more vocal in these meetings, thanks to Sarah's influence, brought up concerns about the treatment of lower-level staff. "We need to start thinking about the long-term effects of our decisions on employee retention," Amelia said, her voice calm but firm. "If we continue to cut benefits and freeze wages, we're going to see more turnover. And that's costly, not just in terms of training, but in terms of morale." The room fell silent for a moment before Mr. William Cartwright, the CEO, spoke up. His tone was as dismissive as ever. "Employee turnover is a fact of life in business, Amelia. We can't cater to everyone's needs. We're running a corporation, not a charity." Sarah's fists clenched under the table, the anger rising in her chest. She had heard enough of Cartwright's dismissive remarks over the past few months, but every time he belittled the concerns of the workers, it stung like a fresh wound. He was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with Crestwell, a man who saw the workforce as expendable, replaceable, and little more than numbers on a spreadsheet. But before Sarah could gather the courage to speak up, another voice cut through the tension. "I think Amelia's right." All eyes turned to Jason Larkin, the company's CFO. He was a younger executive, sharp and ambitious, but not the type to rock the boat. Sarah had never heard him support anything that wasn't directly tied to profit margins. "If we want to maintain profitability in the long run," Jason continued, "we need to invest in our employees. The data shows that companies with higher employee satisfaction rates tend to perform better in the market over time. It's not just about being charitable, it's about being smart." Sarah was stunned. Larkin's words echoed what she and Amelia had been pushing for, but hearing it from someone in the upper echelons of the company made it feel more real, more possible. Cartwright, however, wasn't moved. His icy gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Sarah, before settling back on Amelia and Jason. "We can discuss this further in the next meeting," he said, his tone signaling the end of the conversation. "For now, we need to focus on immediate profits. That's what keeps this company afloat." The meeting ended shortly after, but Sarah could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. As the executives filed out, she exchanged a glance with Amelia, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. But before Sarah could leave, Cartwright approached her, his expression unreadable. He had largely ignored her since the day she'd spoken up in that fateful shareholders' meeting. But now, there was something different in his eyes. "Sarah," he began, his voice low. "A word, please." She followed him into the hallway, her heart pounding. This couldn't be good. Cartwright led her to a small, private office and closed the door behind them. He turned to face her, his imposing figure towering over her smaller frame. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was suffocating. "You've been quite involved in our meetings lately," he said finally, his voice measured. "More involved than I expected." Sarah's throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "I'm here to help make changes that benefit the employees, Mr. Cartwright. That's what Amelia asked me to do." Cartwright's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Amelia may have brought you in, but don't forget who runs this company." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a warning. Cartwright wasn't happy with the direction things were going, and Sarah knew that crossing him was dangerous. "I'm aware of who runs the company," Sarah replied carefully, choosing her words with precision. "But the employees are the ones who make it run. Without them, there is no company." Cartwright's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "Let me give you some advice, Sarah. This company isn't going to change just because you and Amelia want it to. The people in this building care about one thing: profits. And if you start getting in the way of that, you'll find yourself on the outside again, this time for good." Sarah's heart raced, but she refused to let him see her fear. She had worked too hard, risked too much, to back down now. "I understand that, Mr. Cartwright," she said, her voice steady. "But if this company keeps treating its employees like they don't matter, you won't have any profits to chase." For a moment, Cartwright said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Then, without another word, he turned and left the office, leaving Sarah standing there, her pulse pounding in her ears. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the notes she had taken during the day. The conversation with Cartwright had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. He was a powerful man, and she knew he could make her life very difficult if he chose to. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. Not now. Not when so many people were counting on her. Ryan was in bed, and the apartment was quiet, save for the sound of the wind rattling the window. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her, and for the first time in weeks, doubt began to creep in. Could she really do this? Could she stand up to Cartwright and the other executives who only cared about profits? Or would she be crushed under the weight of the corporate machine, just another casualty of Crestwell's relentless pursuit of money? As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Amelia. "Amelia, you did great today, Sarah. I know Cartwright is tough, but don't let him intimidate you. We're making progress. Slowly, but it's happening. Don't lose heart." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. "Sarah, thank you. It's just hard sometimes. He's powerful. I don't know if I can go up against him." The reply came almost instantly. "Amelia, you're stronger than you think. You've already done what most people wouldn't dare to do. You've spoken up. Now we keep pushing, one step at a time." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of determination reignite within her. She wasn't alone in this. Amelia was right. They were making progress. And as long as she had the support of people like Amelia, she could keep going. But the battle wasn't over yet. The next few weeks were tense. Every time Sarah entered a board meeting or spoke with employees, she could feel the invisible eyes watching her, waiting for her to slip up. Cartwright's presence loomed over everything, and she knew he was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Sarah didn't let up. She continued meeting with employees, gathering their stories, and advocating for better wages, better benefits, and more respect. She worked closely with Amelia, drafting proposals for new policies that would protect the workers and improve their working conditions. And slowly, very slowly, she began to see the cracks forming in the rigid corporate structure. Some of the board members, like Jason Larkin, had started to listen. They were beginning to see the long-term benefits of investing in the employees, of creating a company that valued its workforce. But others, like Cartwright, were still resistant, clinging to the old ways of doing business. The tipping point came one afternoon during a critical meeting with the board. Amelia and Sarah had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive proposal that outlined how Crestwell could improve employee satisfaction, reduce turnover, and increase long-term profitability by investing in its workers. It was bold, ambitious, and exactly what the company needed. As they presented the proposal, Sarah could feel the tension in the room. Some of the executives were nodding along, clearly impressed by the data and the potential benefits. But Cartwright remained stone-faced, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Sarah with barely concealed disdain. When they finished the presentation, Amelia turned to the room, her voice calm but firm. "We believe this is the future of Crestwell. A company that values its employees is a company that will thrive in the long run. It's time to make that change." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Cartwright stood, his face hard and unforgiving. "This is a waste of time," he said coldly. "We're here to make money, not coddle the staff. If you want to run a charity, Amelia, you're in the wrong business." Sarah felt the anger rising in her chest, but before she could speak, Amelia stepped forward, her eyes flashing with determination. "I'm not running a charity, William. I'm running a business, and a smart business knows that its greatest asset is its people. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one in the wrong business." The room fell silent. Cartwright's face flushed with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Sarah's heart raced, her body trembling with adrenaline. This was it. The lines had been drawn, and there was no going back. The reckoning. The moment the door slammed behind Cartwright, the room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah stood frozen, her mind spinning as if the air itself had thickened around her. Amelia remained at the head of the table, her back straight, her face unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Jason Larkin, the CFO, cleared his throat awkwardly, his eyes darting between Amelia and the other board members. "Well, that was eventful," Jason said, trying to ease the tension. But no one laughed. The room was still charged with the fallout of the confrontation. No one had ever dared speak to Cartwright like that. Not in all the years Sarah had been with Crestwell. It was a bold move, one that could either signal a turning point or the beginning of a deeper conflict. Amelia looked directly at Sarah, a glint of determination in her eyes. But beneath that, Sarah sensed something more, perhaps weariness or uncertainty. The battle lines had been drawn, and from here on out, things would not be easy. But there was no backing down now. "Thank you, everyone," Amelia said, her voice regaining its usual calm authority. "I think we've covered enough today. Let's reconvene next week with any revisions to the proposal." The board members, still uneasy from the tense exchange, quickly gathered their things, offering quiet nods to Amelia as they exited. Sarah stayed where she was, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. What had just happened? What did it mean for her, for Amelia, and for the future of Crestwell? Once the room had emptied, Amelia finally let out a deep breath and turned to Sarah. "That didn't exactly go as planned, did it?" Amelia said with a wry smile, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a woman who had just taken on the lion's share of the fight. "No, but I think you made your point," Sarah replied, her voice still shaky. "What happens now? Cartwright isn't going to let this go." Amelia leaned back against the conference table, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're right. Cartwright won't back down. He'll fight this tooth and nail, because that's what he does. He's made this company what it is, cold, ruthless, and profitable at any cost. He's not going to change willingly." Sarah felt a pit forming in her stomach. "Then what do we do? I don't know how we're going to convince the board if Cartwright is against us." Amelia's gaze hardened, her voice lowering. "We don't convince Cartwright. We go around him." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, late-night phone calls, and whispered conversations with sympathetic board members. Sarah spent her days continuing to meet with Crestwell's lower-level employees, collecting their stories and adding more fuel to the fire that Amelia was stoking. The proposal they had presented was already bold, but now, with Cartwright openly opposing them, they had to escalate their efforts. Sarah began reaching out to allies within the company, people who had influence, but who hadn't yet chosen sides. She knew that if they were going to have any chance of passing the changes they were advocating for, they would need more than just data and a few persuasive arguments. They needed people who believed in the cause. One of those people was Jason Larkin. He had been quiet in most of the meetings, but Sarah had sensed that he was paying attention. He wasn't like Cartwright. He wasn't blind to the struggles of the employees, and he seemed to understand that long-term profitability was tied to employee well-being. Sarah had seen a flicker of empathy in his eyes during the presentation, and now she needed to fan that flame. Sarah approached Jason in the hallway one afternoon, catching him just as he was leaving his office. "Jason, do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Jason glanced at his watch but nodded. "Sure, Sarah. What's on your mind?" She led him to a quiet corner of the building, away from the prying eyes of Cartwright's loyalists. "I know you've seen the data, and I know you understand the importance of what we're trying to do," Sarah began, her voice measured but urgent. "I need to know if you're with us on this." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple, Sarah. You know how this company works. Cartwright holds all the power. If I openly support this proposal, it could be career suicide." Sarah's heart sank, but she pressed on. "I understand the risks. Believe me, I do. But this isn't just about the numbers. This is about the people who make this company run. People like me, who have been invisible for years. If we don't do something now, nothing will ever change." Jason's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah saw the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. He was torn between loyalty to his career and the growing realization that what Sarah and Amelia were proposing was the right thing to do. After a long pause, Jason finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You have my support, but we need to be smart about this. If we go after Cartwright head-on, he'll crush us. We need to build more support quietly, behind the scenes." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Jason. We won't forget this." Jason nodded, his gaze serious. "Just be careful, Sarah. Cartwright isn't going to go down without a fight." As the days wore on, it became clear that Cartwright was already preparing for battle. He had begun rallying his allies within the company, using his considerable influence to cast doubt on the proposal. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers that Amelia and Sarah's plan would bankrupt the company, that their push for employee benefits would lead to layoffs, that they were naive and idealistic, not cut out for the hard realities of business. But Sarah didn't waver. She continued meeting with employees, gathering their stories, and adding more evidence to their case. She worked closely with Amelia and Jason, refining their arguments and finding ways to counter Cartwright's attacks. It was a slow, grinding process, but Sarah could feel the momentum shifting, bit by bit. Then, one day, the phone call came. Sarah was sitting at home, helping Ryan with his homework, when her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw Amelia's name. Her heart leaped into her throat. Something was happening. "Sarah, we need you at the office right away," Amelia said, her voice tense. "Cartwright's called an emergency board meeting." Sarah's stomach churned. "Why? What's going on?" "Word is he's trying to push through a counterproposal, something that'll shut us down for good. We need to be ready." Sarah hung up the phone, her mind racing. This was it, the final showdown. If Cartwright managed to push through his counterproposal, everything she and Amelia had worked for would be lost. She quickly called Mrs. Millie to come watch Ryan, kissed her son on the forehead, and rushed out the door. As she hurried through the streets, the city lights blurring around her, she felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. This was the moment that would determine everything. the future of Crestwell, the future of its employees, and her own future as well. When Sarah arrived at the office, she found Amelia and Jason waiting for her outside the boardroom, both of them looking grim. "He's trying to paint us as reckless," Amelia explained, her voice tight with frustration. "He's saying that our proposal will ruin the company, and he's got some of the board members scared." Sarah felt a wave of anger rise within her. Cartwright was manipulating the truth, twisting it to maintain his grip on power, but she wasn't going to let him win. Not without a fight. "We can't let him get away with this," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "We have the facts on our side. We've done the work. They need to hear the truth." Amelia nodded. "You're right. But it's going to be an uphill battle. Some of these board members are more loyal to Cartwright than to the truth." As they entered the boardroom, Sarah braced herself for what was about to unfold. The tension in the room was palpable. Cartwright stood at the head of the table, flanked by his allies, his expression cold and calculating. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Cartwright began, his voice smooth but laced with authority. "I've called this meeting to address the proposal that Amelia and her team have been pushing. While I appreciate their passion, I believe their plan is fundamentally flawed. It's risky, it's idealistic, and it puts this company's future in jeopardy." Sarah felt a surge of fury, but she kept her face composed. She knew that Cartwright was trying to paint them as reckless, but she also knew that their proposal was solid. They had the data to back it up. They had the stories of the employees, and they had the support of people like Jason. As Cartwright continued to speak, Sarah's eyes scanned the room, searching for signs of support among the board members. Some looked uneasy, others skeptical, but a few, like Jason, were watching Cartwright with wary eyes. When Cartwright finally finished, Amelia stood up, her expression calm but fierce. "William, with all due respect, you're wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This proposal isn't reckless. It's necessary. The people who work for Crestwell aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're the backbone of this company, and if we continue to treat them like they don't matter, we'll lose them. And when we lose them, we lose everything." Sarah watched as Amelia spoke with passion, laying out the case for why investing in employees wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the smart thing to do. She talked about the research, the data, the long-term benefits of creating a company culture that valued its workers. But more than that, she spoke about the human side of the equation. The janitors, the secretaries, the customer service reps who had shared their stories with Sarah. When Amelia finished, Sarah stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her moment. The moment to speak for the people who had been invisible for too long. "I've worked at Crestwell for over 15 years, Sarah began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been here longer than most of you. I've seen how this company treats its employees, and I've lived through the struggles that so many of them face every day. We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for respect. We're asking for the opportunity to do our jobs without worrying about whether we can pay our bills or take care of our families." The room was silent as Sarah continued, her voice rising with each word. "I've spoken to dozens of employees, people who have given their blood, sweat, and tears to this company. And all they want is to be treated with dignity. If we don't start valuing them, they'll leave. And when they leave, this company will crumble." Sarah's eyes met Cartwright's, and for a moment, she saw the flash of anger in his gaze. But she didn't back down. She had come too far to stop now. "We have the chance to do something incredible here," Sarah finished, her voice strong. "We can create a company that doesn't just chase profits at any cost, but one that values its people. That's the future I want for Crestwell. And I think it's the future we all deserve." There was a moment of silence after Sarah finished speaking, and in that silence, she saw something shift. Some of the board members exchanged glances, their skepticism fading, replaced by something else, something like hope. Jason Larkin was the first to speak. "I think Sarah's right. We've been focusing so much on short-term profits that we've lost sight of the bigger picture. If we don't invest in our people, we're going to lose them, and we can't afford that." Other board members began to nod in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. The tide was turning. Cartwright, however, wasn't ready to give up. "This is a mistake," he snapped, his voice cold. "We're here to make money, not play social workers." But his words no longer held the power they once did. Amelia stood tall, her gaze steady. "This company is more than just profits, William. It's about people. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." The final vote came swiftly. One by one, the board members cast their ballots, and when the votes were tallied, the result was clear. Amelia and Sarah's proposal had passed. Sarah felt a rush of emotion, a mix of relief, joy, and disbelief. They had done it. They had won. As the board members filed out of the room, Cartwright remained where he was, his face tight with anger. He looked at Sarah, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "This isn't over," he said quietly before turning and walking out. But for Sarah, it was over. The fight had been won, and the future of Crestwell was now in the hands of the people who cared about its workers. In the weeks that followed, the changes began to take shape. New policies were implemented to protect the workers, wages were increased, and benefits were expanded. The company's culture started to shift, slowly but surely, and for the first time in years, the employees of Crestwell felt valued. Sarah continued to work with Amelia and Jason, advocating for the people who had trusted her to be their voice. It wasn't easy, change never was, but they were making progress, and that was what mattered. At home, Ryan's health had improved, thanks to the stability that Sarah's new role provided. He was back to playing soccer with his friends, his laughter filling the apartment with joy. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch, watching Ryan draw his latest superhero creation, she felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she had found her purpose. She had fought for something that mattered, and she had won. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah knew that everything was going to be okay. Epilogue. A few months after the proposal passed, Sarah received a letter from Amelia. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but the words meant everything. "Sarah, we did it. You did it. Thank you for your courage, your heart, and your strength. Crestwell is a better place because of you. Here's to the future we've built together. Amelia." Sarah smiled as she read the letter, her heart swelling with pride. She had never imagined her life would take this path, but now that she was here, she wouldn't have changed a thing. The cleaner who had challenged the CEO had become the woman who transformed the company, and in doing so, had transformed her own life.